Hello everyone, welcome back to our Cardiac and Service Education program, Know the Heart of ICU. Today we are going to start with the Unit 2, the conduction blocks. In Unit 2 you have two chapters to learn. In the first chapter we will deal with AV blocks, that's we are going to do in this session. And the second chapter you will learn about bundle branch blocks. After today's session you will be able to detect AV blocks, and you should be able to differentiate between first degree, second degree and third degree AV blocks. And in the second degree AV blocks, you have your Morbitz type 1 and type 2 AV blocks. So you will learn all those things together today. Before we start with the AV blocks, you need to refresh your conduction system. When it comes to the heart's conduction system, it normally starts from your SA node. Your SA node is a primary impulse generator or the pacemaker of your heart. If the SA node fails or any other part of the heart fires faster than SA node, that's the only time you have an abnormal rhythm, the dysarrhythmia. You have learned about that before. So today we are going to learn about AV blocks. That means we are dealing with the SA nodal rhythms. Okay. So you have your SA node, and when that fires the impulse should go to your AV node. It should travel to the AV node so that it can go down to the ventricles. Meantime, it should travel to the other parts of the atria. So there are two different kinds of conduction systems or branches of conduction systems, or nerve fibers or conduction channels exist with SA node. One is internodal bundles. That means the conduction bundles that connects between SA node and AV node. And the other bundles are interatrial bundles. The SA node situates in the right atria, and the impulse should travel to the right atria and to the left atria. So there are interatrial bundles as well. If there is any issues with the internodal bundles, there are mainly three sets of bundles that connects between the SA node and AV node. If there is any issues with the internodal bundles, that prevents the impulse from SA node reaching normally at the AV node. It may reduce the speed, or sometimes it may miss a beat altogether. That's, in summary, is called as your AV blocks. So there is some abnormality between the conduction between SA node and AV node that produces your AV blocks. And based on the severity of that, the AV blocks can be different: first degree, second degree or third degree AV blocks. So how a normal stuff happens: when the SA node fires, the impulse will be traveled to the atria through the interatrial bundle. So you have a P wave. Meantime, once SA node fires, the impulse will travel, part of the impulse will travel from SA node to AV node through your internodal bundles. And once the impulse reaches the AV node fires it down through your bundle of His, right bundle, left bundle and your Purkinje fibers for the ventricles to contract or depolarize in electrically. So the internodal bundles, that's a significant portion of the conduction system that connects your SA node and AV node. So if there is any abnormality there comes your AV block. Let's see what's in first degree AV block. Just for example, if you're traveling from Dublin to Donegal, if the roads are smooth and no traffic, you reach at the correct time, estimated time of arrival. Just imagine there is a roadworks in between. What happens? You reach Donegal, but the problem is it may be delayed. That is, in simple terms, your first degree AV block. Your internodal bundles have some issues, so the impulse transmission from your SA node to your AV node is delayed than normal. But every impulse produced in the SA node still reaching the AV node, every single impulse producing the SA node still reaching the AV node, but the total time taken for the travel is prolonged because the bundle is not good, the road is not good, so car will take longer than usual to reach the destination. The same way, when the bundle is not good, it takes long time for an SA node impulse to travel through the AV node, internodal bundles to reach the AV node. As soon as it reaches the AV node, it fires down to your ventricles and you have a QRS complex and a T wave. But this time frame is called as your PR interval, the beginning of your P wave and the beginning of your QRS complex. That's your PR interval. That is the place you can see the delay in the conduction. So your PR interval will be longer than usual. In simple terms, it's longer than 200 milliseconds or 5 mm or 0.2 seconds. If you're telling it in seconds, 0.2 seconds. If you're telling it in milliseconds, more than 200 milliseconds. And if you are measuring in mm in a normal standard speed ECG, it is more than 5 mm. So if that happens, we call it as a first degree AV block. You can see here, if you look at this ECG a bit closer, I can just increase I can zoom it. So you can see here the SA node fires and it reaches the AV node at this point. See the difference? So it starts here, the impulse starts here from SA node, but it reaches the AV node at this point. So in total, how many mm here? 5 plus 4, 9 mm. 9 mm is around 360 milliseconds. Instead of 200 milliseconds, it took 360 milliseconds, or instead of 5 mm in a standard ECG, it took 9 mm to reach the AV node. That means it's a first degree heart block. But the main characteristic of the first degree heart block, along with the prolonged PR interval, every single P wave should have a QRS complex. It just delays you, but it will not stop you from traveling altogether. If there is a road work, it delays your transport, but if because of flood or something happened and the road is completely washed away, it stops you from traveling. So in first degree AV block, there is no stopping, like you are still traveling but in a slow rate. So the two characteristics you have to memorize. The first one is you have the PR interval prolonged. That means your PR interval is more than 200 milliseconds or 5 mm. And the second characteristic, all P wave will have a QRS complex. If any of the P wave don't have a QRS complex, that is your second degree heart block, not a first degree heart block. If there is no missing but still a prolonged QRS, that's your first degree heart block. First degree heart block is usually will not cause any troubles clinically. We don't pace or anything unless the patient is clinically symptomatic. Usually the patients won't be clinically symptomatic, so it doesn't warrant an immediate clinical treatment. But you have to be careful regarding your AV nodal slowing agents like your beta blockers. Okay, let's go to the second degree AV blocks. As I mentioned before, in second degree AV block, it's not just delaying. Some beats cannot be transferred to, it cannot travel up to the AV node. Some impulses will miss en route. That's your second degree AV block. If the impulse from AV node reaches impulse from SA node reaches the AV node, you have a QRS complex. If the impulse from SA node don't reach the AV node, you will just have a P wave and there will not be any QRS complex after the P wave, because P wave denotes SA node impulses traveling through the different branch of bundles. That's your interatrial bundles. It doesn't have anything to do with your AV blocks. The AV blocks happens in the internodal bundles, the bundle that connects SA node and AV node. So in second degree AV block, it's more severe than first degree. It don't just delays, instead it stops some beats in between. So that's your second degree AV blocks. For some P waves, there will not be any following QRS complex. That's a characteristic of second degree AV block. Based on the nature, broadly we classify the second degree AV block into two, Morbitz type 1 and Morbitz type 2. In some textbooks, you may find a 2:1 block that looks almost similar to your third degree heart block. Clinically, it will be treated as a third degree heart block. So if it is 2:1 block, don't worry about that. But we will focus mainly on Mobitz type 1 and Mobitz type 2. In Mobitz type 1, this is the easiest one to identify. So it's kind of the PR interval will be progressively prolonging. That's the term, progressively prolonging. You can see that in the first wave, you can see that the P wave and normal PR interval and impulse transmitted to through the internodal bundles. SA node fires, impulse travel through the internodal bundles. It reached the AV node in right time, and you have a QRS complex. Then the next impulse, next SA node firing took longer time than usual, but still it reached the AV node and you have a QRS complex. The next impulse took longer than the previous impulse, progressively prolonging PR interval. So the PR interval or time taken for an impulse to travel from your SA node to AV node, it's progressively prolonging for every single beat, and some stage you will lose a beat at all. After a P wave, no QRS complex. This P wave is not conducted through the internodal bundle. So you're missing a QRS complex after a P wave. So it has two different characteristics you have to look for. Not all the P waves are followed by QRS complex. And the second thing, the PR interval is progressively prolonging. Then a P wave is not conducted down to form a QRS complex. Then it restarts again the same story. Normal PR interval and progressively prolonging PR interval, then misses a beat. Then it restart again. So it's a kind of a cycle. It restart again after a missing beat. So this is your Mobitz type 1. So look for progressively prolonging QRS complex and missing a QRS complex after P wave, then restarting again the progressively prolonging QRS complex. That is your Mobitz type 1. Why it is called as Mobitz means one of the bundles in between SA node and AV node, it's called as Mobitz. It's found by the Mobitz. That's why it's Mobitz bundle. That's why it's called as Mobitz type 1 and Mobitz type 2. Okay, whatever. This is predictable. We can predict that after, see if the patient has this rhythm, after every 3 beats you have a miss beat, and it's progressively prolonging and you have a miss beat and restarting, progressively prolonging and miss beat. So it's predictable. So it doesn't warrant a pacemaker and doesn't warrant much of the treatment, but only think about before you prescribe or give your beta blockers. And what is then the type 2, Mobitz type 2 of second degree AV blocks? As I mentioned, if all impulses, that means all SA nodal impulses are conducted down to AV node, it's delayed, that's first degree. If some impulses are missing, it's second degree. If the impulses are missing after progressively prolonged QRS complex in a predictable manner, that's your Mobitz type 1. But if the impulses are missed in an unpredictable manner, even sometimes maybe without a prolonged PR interval, that's called as your Mobitz type 2. In Mobitz type 1, you can predict the pattern. You can predict where it would miss a QRS complex. But if there is no pattern is followed, that's called as your Mobitz type 2. So you can see here P wave, QRS T, P wave, QRS T, and P wave, QRS T, and P wave is not conducted. Unpredictably missing QRS complex. Then again P wave, QRS T, P wave, QRS T, and then miss a beat again. So there will be P wave not conducted. So unconducted P waves in an unpredictable fashion is called as Mobitz type 1. Unconducted P waves in a predictable fashion after a progressively prolonged PR interval is your Mobitz type 1. And as I mentioned, there is another classification that's called as 2:1 block. That's every alternate P waves are not conducted. So it looks exactly similar to your third degree heart block, but it was not third degree heart block. It is 2:1 block. But don't mess up with that at this stage. When you learn further, you can see the difference between 2:1 block and your complete heart block. Okay, the final thing. Now you know the first degree heart block, just delays, no miss beat. Then you know your second degree heart block, there are missed P wave, QRS complex. That means P waves are not conducted. And if it follows a pattern of progressively prolonged PR and then misses a beat, that's your type 1, Morbitz type 1. And it's unpredictable, Morbitz type 2. And what is then the complete heart block or third degree heart block? None of the SA node impulses are fired down to reaching the AV node. That's your complete heart block. That means no SA nodal impulse is transmitted through the internodal bundles to reach the AV node. That means you will have only your P waves, no QRS from SA node. What happens then? The patient will arrest. Because if there is no QRS, no ventricular contraction, that means you will arrest. So, to prevent the cardiac arrest, to prevent the collapse, the heart will do kind of a backup mechanism. What happens as a backup mechanism, the ventricle itself or the junction, that's the AV node, will produce a beat to pass down to the ventricle to cause a ventricular contraction. But as you know, AV node has a slower rate and ventricle has a slower rate. So SA node produces P waves here, and none of the P waves are transmitted down to the ventricle. So either the AV node or the ventricle produce an impulse for ventricular contraction, so QRS. But usually the ventricular rate and the junction rate is somewhere between 35 to somewhere less than 50, 35 to 40s, late 40s maybe. So the rate will be different between your P rate will be different from your QRS rate. So the P waves are not conducted down. SA node fires regular P waves, maybe 60 beats per minute or 80 beats per minute or 90 beats per minute based on the SA nodal rate. But none of these P waves are coming down to your AV node to pass down to the ventricle. So your P wave rate will be somewhere in the SA nodal rates in between 60 to 100 or more than that if it's tachycardia. But your QRS rate follows its source. If the QRS is originated from AV node, it follows somewhere around 35 to 45, 48 in that range. But if the QRS complex originated from the ventricle, it follows a ventricular rate that's somewhere around 35, 40 in that range. Even 25 to 40 in that range. So it's slower. So RR interval will be longer and R waves are kind of brady and P waves are normal or tachy. So both has different rate. When you see R waves have different rhythm, different rate and P waves are different rate, definitely not from the same origin. You can see from an example here. See the P rates here? P, 1P, P, 1 P wave is mixed with the T wave here. That's why you can hear notch here. P. So P rate is faster, but see the ventricular rate. I missed the ventricular rate here. Okay. So see the ventricular rate. The ventricular rate is very slow. We can see that. The ventricular rate is slow. So when the rate is slow, the sources are different. You can see it's a broad complex, so source is ventricle. And now you can see that none of the P waves are conducted down to the ventricle. Instead, SA node fires the P wave and some other part of the heart fires the ventricle. So that's your complete heart block, complete AV dissociation. So P waves are regular and QRS complex are regular, but P rate is different from QRS complex rate. Usually P rate will be more than QRS complex rate. No P waves are conducted down. No QRS complex follows the P wave. P wave is from SA node and QRS is from some other part of the heart, maybe AV node or the ventricle. So that's called as complete heart block or complete AV dissociation or third degree AV block. This is a clear indication for pacemaker, and Morbitz type 2 or 2:1 block is a clear indication for immediate indication for pacemaker. None of the AV blocks are not an indication for AV blocks. So when we summarize the AV blocks, the first degree AV block, second degree AV block, third degree AV block. In first degree AV block, just the conduction is delayed, but all the P waves reaches the AV node and produce QRS complex. So all the P waves will have a QRS complex, but the PR interval is prolonged. In second degree AV block, some P waves are not conducted down. In third degree AV blocks, no P waves are conducted down, The QRS complex is produced from some other part of the heart, maybe AV node or ventricle. In second degree AV block, if it follows a pattern, progressively prolonged PR interval and missing a beat, that's your Mobitz type 1. It follows no pattern, unpredictable missing of QRS complex, that's your Mobitz type 2. So that's your AV blocks. It's easy to recognize. We'll go for a quick practical session as well. I will pop up my screen here and we'll have a quick practical session. That's not an AV block, that's your VFib. Okay, look at this. You can see here, okay, look at this first. What's abnormality? You have a P wave, you have QRS, T, P wave, QRS, T, everything is normal and rate is normal, 74. So in the first instance, you may think that, oh, it's a normal sinus rhythm. Every P wave has QRS complex and narrow QRS complex and it's normal rate and normal rhythm. So it's a normal sinus rhythm. But look at the PR interval. PR interval is more than 5 mm. That means more than 200 milliseconds. SA node 5 is here and it is not reaching the AV node within the 200 milliseconds or 5 mm time frame. It's taking longer than usual. That's your first degree AV block. Your PR intervals are prolonged. But you can see here, no QRS complex is missing. Every P wave has a corresponding QRS complex. So it's not a second degree AV block or a third degree AV block. In second degree AV block, some QRS are missing. Some P waves are not conducted down. In third degree AV block, no P waves are conducted down. QRS is from different source and there follows a different rate. So this is your first degree AV block. And look at this, buddy. See the P wave, PR interval, QRS, and see the P wave, PR interval is prolonged than the previous one and QRS. See the P wave, PR interval is prolonged again, more prolonged than the previous one, and this next P wave is not conducted down. That means no QRS complex, missing P wave. So it's a second degree AV block. Some P waves, not missing P, missing QRS. Some P waves are not conducted down. Not all P waves, most of the P waves are conducted down, but some P waves are missing, not conducted down. That means some QRS are missing here. This P wave doesn't have a corresponding QRS complex. So what happened then? Progressively prolonged PR interval. See, progressively prolonged PR interval, and the P wave is not conducted down, and you don't have a QRS complex followed by the P wave. Again, restarting the cycle, progressively prolonged PR interval and missing a QRS complex for the P wave. Again, the cycle restarts. So that's your Mobitz type 1. So here some of the P waves are not conducted down. That means some of the P waves are not followed by corresponding QRS complex and the PR interval is progressively prolonging. So that means it's a Mobitz type 1, second degree heart block, but Mobitz type 1. And look at this. What is this? You have P wave, QRS, T, P, QRS, T, P, QRS, T. Everything looks okay, sinus rhythm. But suddenly, some P waves are not conducting down. So some P waves doesn't have a corresponding QRS complex. Unpredictable. So after a couple of beats happened, but now after two normal PQRS T complexes, it's happening again. See now, two P waves are not conducted. Totally unpredictable pattern. Some P waves are not conducted down, so it's type 2, it's a second degree heart block. Not all P waves, most of the P waves are conducted down, but some P waves are not conducted down to have a corresponding QRS. So it's a second degree AV block, but not Mobitz type 1 because there is no pattern, no progressively prolonged PR interval. It's just unpredictable missing of QRS. That is your Mobitz type 2. This is the 2:1 block. It's really hard to identify. That's why I didn't take it. You see the constant PR intervals here. It's every alternative P waves are not conducted on. Don't look at that. That's fine. That's for advanced practitioners. So look at here. See the P wave? Yeah, there's P wave. There is a P wave hidden here. When you compare the QRS complexes, this has a little notch. That's a P wave, P wave, P wave. P wave is regular. And even the QRS is regular. Everything is regular. But look at the rate. P rate is P is faster than QRS. QRS rate is 36 and P rate somewhere around 70s. That means it's complete AV dissociation. No P waves are conducted down to AV node to form a QRS complex. QRS is produced by a ventricular origin because it's a broad QRS complex. So this QRS complex is of ventricular origin. That means P wave is produced by SA node. No P wave is reaching the ventricle. So ventricle is producing a agonal rhythm or ventricular rhythm. So it's a mix of a sinus P wave and a ventricular QRS. So ventricular QRS always have lower rate, sinus P wave will always have a higher rate. So the end result is like this complete AV dissociation. So this is your third degree AV block. P waves will be regular but it will be faster than QRS complex rate. QRS will be regular but it will follow a different rate than the P wave. P and QRS is produced from different origins. That's why the difference in the rate. And no P wave is followed by QRS complex. Instead, P wave follows its own rhythm, QRS follows its own rhythm. Both have total dissociation, complete AV dissociation or third degree heart block. So this is our AV blocks. In the next session, in the next unit, we learn about our bundle branch blocks, and with that we finish our unit 2. Okay, thank you for watching and good luck with your studies.